when I left Branson, Missouri, and I passed through Oklahoma, they were getting the hay in. Now that I understand why my voice is hoarse. So I'm struggling with this. I'm hoping it'll hold up today and tomorrow, and we can continue our study. I'll put up my website up on the screen up there. I've had several of you ask me if somehow they could get access to these PowerPoint presentations. And so when we finish the session today and I finalize my lesson for tomorrow, we'll make these available. And when you go to the website, you'll see some kind of instructions there. I'll probably put it under the software tab, or I may make a separate tab for it. But anyway, I'll make these available to you, and hopefully you'll find some benefit for them. Is there a John Henry in here today? John Henry? If you know John Henry, would you let him know he needs to see my wife in the book room? And I have a greater appreciation now for somebody saying, would you put your John Henry here? He's a real person, sir. Who?
John or Don?
Maybe Don Henry. Is there a Don? Are you Don Henry? Did you buy some books from my wife? You need to go see her. And change your name to John so that my story will fill in. So another thing that I want to make available to you, and I have produced years ago, I produced a filing system for PC operators, people who have PC computers, where you can file your books, and then in the card catalog section you can actually enter quotes. You can take stuff off the internet, put it in the note file on that particular record, and it's a great tool for retrieving information that you want to remember where it's at. And I know that our modern day computer system with all of its search capabilities, even within files, is really valuable, but this allows you to do multiple searches. And if you go to my website into the section that has software, you can download that for free. Now, when you download it, you'll see a number there. There's 2 files to download. You'll see a number there that you have to use to temporarily unlock it. And then after you've unlocked it, it'll say 30 days to use. And if you'll email me and let me know that you have it, then I will send you an unlock key after the permanent unlock key after the 30 days. That's for free. You're welcome to use it if you would like. And
Does that work on a Mac computer too?
no, I've built a little system for Macs, but the problem is with the PC, I can lock everything in. You can't change it. You can't tamper with it. And I can't do that with the Mac version of it, because the Mac version runs off LibreOffice or OpenOffice. But it runs better off LibreOffice. It's a free program, and if you have a Mac computer and you're interested in that, if you'll let me know, I'll see if I can get that file to you as well, and hopefully you'll find some benefit in it. I'm a firm believer in filing things away, and it pays rich dividends. When we came out of Brown Trail, you remember we didn't have computer stuff. And I used an old minister's filing system as a ledger book. And in the first 6 or 7 years of my preaching, I filed more than 10,000 entries into that ledger book. And then the computer age hit. And I thought, this is great. And I started transferring those 10,000 records into my database, and now I have about 54,000 records in there, and I can find things by author, by title, but you have to be consistent in it. I'm not here to discuss that. Let's talk about Ephesians. I keep reminding myself that we're just not going to have time to deal with everything that we want to deal with. We're talking about the wealth of the Christian. We've talked about the wealth of the Christian, and yesterday we started the series on the walk of the Christian. I want to finish that today. I'm just not going to have time to touch on the worship of the Christian. So let me encourage you to do this on this particular topic. If you will just sit and read Ephesians just very carefully and watch for statements in there that affect or have a bearing on how we worship God. I think you're going to be surprised. I came up with a dozen references. I bow my knees unto the Father, Paul would say. Or what about the 7 ones? One of these is there's one God and Father of all who is over all and through all and in you all. That's unity of worship. He's the one that we worship. So I wish we had time. Maybe I'll make a PowerPoint on this and put it on the website as well. But hopefully you can get some benefit out of what we do have. Then tomorrow we're going to talk about the warfare of the Christian and some things that I was working on this lesson yesterday between my coughing and my hacking and trying to get some rest. And preachers, have you ever just revamped something right at the last? You just see something and it strikes you in a different way. Well, this struck me yesterday. And I'm going to share with you what I've got when I get through with it. Let's talk about the walk of the Christian. We've talked about walking in love. There are a couple of others here, walking in the light and walking in wisdom. I'm going to try to get these last two in this session. Walking in the light is basically, there's some principles when you start talking about walking in the light. 1 John chapter 1, 6 through 8, it's a type of behavior. Or Psalm chapter 1, when you talk about walking in the light, you're talking about this. We're talking about this right here. And there are restrictions. We're restricted to what's in the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. And you're familiar with these passages that I've put up here. But Ephesians chapter 5, verse 20, for example, makes reference to their need for knowledge and obedience. Galatians 1, 8 and 9, though we or an angel from heaven preach unto you any gospel other than that which you have received, let him be anathema. Revelation 22, 18 and 19. In other words, the thrust in all of these summed up in, like 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 6, these things I have in a figure transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you might learn in us what? Well, the King James says not to think more highly of men than that which is written. American Standard says that you might not go beyond that which is written. It's the same principle. We abide in the doctrine of Christ. 2 John, well, there's only one chapter, verses 9 and following. You abide within the doctrine of Christ. Isn't it unfortunate that today we have so many who claim, I'm talking about churches of Christ, that have abandoned this very principle right here. And their approach now is, well, if the Bible doesn't condemn it, we can practice it. That's a dangerous philosophy. The Highland Church of Christ out in Abilene, Texas, many years ago, began that trek with that kind of mentality. And it wasn't long before they were saying, well, we're going to restudy. That's somebody's, we're going to restudy. That's another way of saying we're going to try to find an excuse for what we're doing. We're going to restudy the instrumental music question. And then they decided they're going to restudy the role of women in the church. And now recently they said we're going to restudy whether women can be elders or not. And now they've appointed elders, women elders as well. But we're to walk according to the wise. And there are certain restrictions when we walk in the light. And so we're going to deal with three things. It's a walk of distinction, a walk of sober thinking, and a walk of three distinguishing marks. If you want to turn to Ephesians chapter 5, our thoughts are basically going to come out of this chapter for this lesson on walking in the light. And I'm going to have to really hurry on some of this. So let's take a look at these. Let's talk about the walk of distinction. Here you're talking about purity. Look at chapter 5 and verse 3, if you will. Fornication, all uncleanness and covetousness, let it not even be named among you. It's not to even be the center of our discussion. It doesn't say you can't ever use the words, or Paul would have violated his own principle here. He's saying this is not to be the focus of our life. It's not to be part of our life. It's not to be part of our discussions in the sense that we lend any kind of favorability to it. But we're talking about purity. So all of these, fornication, uncleanness, covetousness, They're not to be a part of our lives. And I wish I had the time just to focus on some of these. Fornication, of course, is a broad term, and it includes adultery, bestiality, homosexuality. It's just a broad term that deals with sexual immorality. And then uncleanness, anything that is, I don't think he's talking about hygienically unclean here. He's talking about things that produce moral uncleanliness. I don't know about you, brethren. I feel like a lot sometimes. My soul is vexed at what I'm seeing on the television. Well, not the TV. I don't watch TV anymore. But what I see on the news. When you have a president that stands before the people on a press conference and he says, we're going to defend the rights of the homosexuals, and on and on and on and on. It's very disturbing. So we're dealing here with a sense of purity. And look at these passages, all of which deal with distinction. We are to be a different people. 2 Corinthians 6:14 through chapter 7 and verse 1. I'm going to focus just on the 17th verse here. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17. Come ye out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. Touch no unclean thing. And I will be to you a father, and you shall be to me sons and daughters. Come out from among them. It's unfortunate that the world is coming into the church. We ought to be coming out of the world and being distinct. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 15, we're to be holy, if you will. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 4, Peter describes the reaction of the world when we are so unique. They think it's strange that you not walk with them. I like that phrase, walk with them. That's exactly what we're describing here. Romans chapter 12, 1 through 3. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. We are to be perfect. Now there's a relative sense to that. I'm not going to be sinless, but I'm to always strive for perfection. That ought to be part of my life. And as men, we lead the way on that. And you're not going to be leading the way and striving for perfection if you allow your eyes to go places where they ought not to go. What did David say? I will not put any unclean thing before my eyes. I will not do it. And that's where it starts, is what you look at. That's the window into your heart. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in another point and try to stress some of the implications of that. It's also a walk of sober thinking. Look at chapter 5 and verse 3 again. Fornication, all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be named among you as become a saints, nor filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not befitting, but rather giving of thanks. And the emphasis here is there's certain things that I don't allow to come into my mind. And so if you look at some of these, filthiness has to do with moral filthiness. And then you also have foolishness. Some things, how do you put this? A fool has been defined in various ways. Fool is a person who keeps doing the same thing over and over again, thinking he's going to get different results. Does Washington have a problem with that? Do our public leaders have problems with that? They do. And there's jesting. This is taking things that are supposed to be serious and treating them lightly with no due respect that's owed to that. He's not condemning here being a little jovial at times and even trying to interject some humor from time to time. Sometimes when I try to inject a little humor, I don't get anybody to laugh. And then when I'm serious, people laugh, and I'm wondering what I'm doing wrong on that. And then there's things that are just not befitting. And we're not to even speak those things. And yet today, look at what is happening in our society. Little children are using language that I used to hear in backyard gutters where the military people were at. Now little children are learning those words. And why? Through public media. Instead, we are to be influenced by passages like Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 through 9. Whatever things are true, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure. You think on these things. The mind becomes the avenue of what we become. And we influence our actions by the way that we think. Now, let me just expand on this a little bit. I don't have a slide on it, but I mentioned guarding our eyes, where we allow our eyes to roam. Because when we allow our eyes to roam to places where they ought not to be, it affects the thinking. Our society today seems to think that engagement in sin is not all that big a deal. And it eventually influences the way we act. It's a walk of distinction, a walk of sober thinking, and a walk with three distinguishing marks. And this is verses 9 through 13. If you go back and let's just read a little bit. Really, we need to back up to verse 5. Let's start with verse 5. Ephesians 5, verse 5. For this you know of a surety, that no fornicator, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no man deceive you with empty words, for because of these things comes the wrath of God. The point that to be emphasized is if I'm thinking on things that are wrong and engaging in things that are wrong, I'm going to answer to God for it. Brother Don Blackwell, I mentioned, I think it was yesterday, that he presented a great lesson at the Branson Lectures on the media and what the media is doing. By the way, here's an interesting point just for observation. Did you know that when he was dealing with homosexuality and Facebook shut him down? 15 minutes into his lesson, they shut him down because they knew what was coming. But the point that he was trying to make in this is that people don't realize they're going to face God on the judgment day for the way that they think and act. Let's talk about some of this. It produces good fruit. Here's some of the distinguishing features. Look at this verse, 9th verse. For the fruit of the light is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. If I'm walking in the light, this is going to be part of the fruit of the way that I'm living. Paul in Galatians referred to the fruit of the Spirit, and he lists about 6 or 7 character traits there. Have you ever wondered why it references singular, the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit here of righteousness? I came to this conclusion many years ago, and I may be entirely off base on this. But in Galatians 5, Paul talks about the works, plurality of the flesh, and the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is a package thing. You have to have all the fruit of the Spirit in your life. That's a package thing. You can engage in one work of the flesh and lose your soul. But you have to have the fruit, all of it, of the Holy Spirit in order to save the soul. So these people who say, well, you know, this is my little vice and I have this problem and God understands. No, He doesn't understand. And men, we are leaders, and we have to abstain from things that are evil and ungodly. And in our world today, a world of temptation, that's a challenge. I have made mention, and so have others as well. I would be challenged to raise children in this generation. I worried about what our children would face 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And it's even worse now. So it produces good fruit. We could ask a question there. What kind of fruit are you bearing? You see, if you're not bearing the fruit, you're not walking in the light. It's a natural outcome. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 1 for just a moment, and I'll come back to Ephesians. But I want you to look at 2 Peter chapter 1. I want you to look at the fruit of the Spirit here. The virtues, what we call the virtues, rather. Starting in verse 5. For this very cause, adding on your part all diligence, in your faith supply virtue knowledge, in your knowledge self-control, in your self-control patience, in your patience godliness, and in your godliness brotherly kindness, your brotherly kindness love. Now watch verse 8. For if these are yours and abound, they make you not to be unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Sometimes we find brethren who are just wringing their hands. Am I doing enough? Am I producing enough fruit? Don't worry about it. Just get on with living the Christian life, and the fruit will come naturally. It's just a process of fruit bearing that comes as a natural result of being a part of Christ. Now, it enables proper decision making. Go back to Ephesians chapter 5. So one of the distinguishing marks is it produces good fruit. Another is that it enables proper decision making. And I'm looking at chapter 5, verse 10, proving what is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Not everything we see is just black and white. There are certain things that they have implications to them. And I have to be able to discern that. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 5. When by reason you ought to be teachers, the Hebrew writer said in verse 12. He said, you need again that someone teach you the rudiments of the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not solid food or meat. Now look at verse 14 in Hebrews 5. But solid food is for full-grown men, even those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. There's 4 points to be made here. One of these is, it is for full-grown men, men who mature as they move through their Christian journey. Every Christian life is described as either a journey closer to God or a journey away from God. There's no middle ground on this. So I'm moving toward God, full-grown men, those things who by reason, some things just common sense says they're wrong. But not all things are real apparent. By reason of use, have their senses exercised to discern. Your senses, your thinking has to be exercised. Give yourself to reading, Paul said. To Timothy also said, exercise thyself in godliness. And every time I resist a temptation, I'm exercising those spiritual muscles. But then look at this, have their senses exercised to do what? To discern good and evil. You ever have somebody come to you and say, well, I don't see anything wrong with this. And when it's blatantly false, and you know it is, they're not exercising their senses to discern. I think people who try to defend, for example, social drinking, imbibing alcohol, they're not using their common sense that God gave to them. Not only that, they're just not reading the scriptures like they should. So it enables me to make proper decisions. And as leaders, men, we are leaders. We need to be exercising proper leadership and discerning. We'll talk about some of the relationships here in a little bit. But it also is a distinguishing mark is that I'm bold in the face of error. I'm not going to have fellowship with error. Go back to Ephesians 5 and look, if you will, at verse 11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather even reprove them. The negative side is you don't associate with unfruitful works of darkness. I've had brethren who, swinging way to the left, said, well, you can fellowship denominations because what they're doing is, it's not a work of darkness that brethren, if they're not teaching the truth, it's a work of darkness. Amen. You can't have light and darkness mixing together. What concord, Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, does light have with darkness? Here's a point that I think needs to be emphasized. Somebody said, well, the non-Christian cannot produce any good fruit. But he can. But he doesn't have God's blessings on it. In other words, can a person in a denomination exercise self-control? Well, of course he can. Fruit of the Spirit. Can he exercise goodness and kindness? Well, of course he can. But he can't do it with God's blessings. That's the difference, you see. And so, expose it. Look at verse 11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather do what? Reprove them. We're involved actively in addressing error and sin. And when we get over to the walk in wisdom, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I'm hastening to get to Pentecost to get to Jerusalem before Pentecost. That was a favorite phrase that Roy Deaver used to use. I'm trying to get to Jerusalem before Pentecost. So we've seen a walk in love, walk in light, and now we're going to spend a little bit of time on walk in wisdom as we contemplate what it means to engage in this walk. This is not 3 different walks. If you can imagine a highway with different lanes, and we're moving down this highway, the walk in love has to do with my relationship toward God. I'm doing the best I can to follow His will, agape love, and it finds its application toward God and toward my fellow man. To walk in light is my relationship to the world. I don't walk in darkness, as the Ephesians had once done, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. And then I walk in wisdom. That's the practical application of it. So when you leave this conference tomorrow or Sunday or whenever you go home, just remember this. If you leave here and there's no application of it, you haven't really accomplished a whole lot. You've enjoyed the fellowship, got a lot of good material, but there's got to be practical application on this. I want to turn over to James chapter 1, and I'm going to just a minute or two on this, but I'll leave this up here just to kind of expose you to it. James had told his audience, count it all joy. You see verse 2, when you fall into manifold temptations. And there are certain things that temptations and trials produce. It produces strength, stamina, if we don't give in to it. So how do you do that? So look at what James says in verse 5. But if any of you lacketh wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. But let him ask in faith, nothing doubting. So I'm to make sure that I ask in faith. I'm to be engaged in pursuing this with faith. Turn over to James chapter 3, if you will. Look at verse 13. I don't have this verse up here, but I'll give it to you for your hearing. Look at verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by his good life his works of meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and faction in your heart, glory not, lie not against the truth. This is wisdom, James says, that comes down from above. But this wisdom is not a wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, sensual, and devilish. There is such a thing as worldly wisdom. But our pursuit is to be with heavenly wisdom, godly wisdom. It is not involved in jealousy. I'm not divisive. It's not confusing. It's not worldly. It's not evil, but it is pure and peaceful, and it's gentle. It's approachable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, real. There's a whole lesson just in itself that you need to deal with when you deal with wisdom. It is a wisdom that's going to sustain you in times of trial and tribulation. I love that passage in Isaiah 40, the last verse. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall walk and not be weary. They shall run and not faint. They shall be mounted up with wings of eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. That's heavenly wisdom. It's going to sustain us. I want to be that kind of a wise person. Okay, let's look at some points under this walk in wisdom then. And the first of these is, if I'm going to walk in wisdom, I've got to exercise a certain sense of caution. Let's go back to Ephesians chapter 5 and look, if you will, at verse 15. And one of the words that keeps popping up here is this word walk. Look at verse 15. Look, therefore, carefully how you walk. Look, and out of this, there are some great important principles that come out. For example, looking has the idea of an intense scrutinization of what I'm observing. John would say to the Pharisees in John chapter 1, as he met with those coming out to hear John the Baptist, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. That word is a close scrutinization. In other words, a casual look at my walk is never going to produce the fruit of what it needs to be. There's in this some self-examination, I think. You have to be honest with yourself. One of the great dangers of sin is it deceives us. It blinds us to what it really is. And so the Hebrews writer would say to the Hebrew brethren in chapter 2, don't be deceived. Don't be self-deceived. If you are engaged in some things that are unholy and unrighteous, And maybe there's a corner of your mind where you know that's wrong. If you push that out of the mind, you're going to deceive yourselves where you eventually end up engaging in that. Take a close look. Take self-inventory from time to time. There's something else. Look, therefore, carefully how you walk. I got up in the night a couple of nights ago and got everything cleared out between the bed and the bathroom, and little bitty lip going from the bedroom into the hallway of that hotel room. And I stubbed my toe on that. I couldn't see it. Look carefully how you walk. And then there's the word walk, present tense. Be careful what you're doing. Exercise caution in this. How do we do it? It's intentional. It's not accidental. Why do we do it? Because there are obstacles out there. What are some of the obstacles? Pride, false teachers, neglect, disbelief, immorality, attention seeking. Don't give your alms to be seen of men. To the preacher students that are going to be graduating soon, or those who are going to be graduating later, or to us as far as that goes. What are we? We're servants. We're servants. And I've lived long enough to see so many people who are Diotrephes. Once they get power, there's a change that takes place. I've experienced that to the extent that I got fired on a couple of occasions. So you need to make sure that you're not out to just get attention. And God will use you. And if you never rise to a place where you're maybe in the limelight from time to time, don't worry about it. God sees you. He knows what you're doing. There was a brother of Christ in Oklahoma where I preached for 9 years, and he worked at TGNY, then later he worked at Gibson's, and then later he worked at Walmart. And very quiet man. But he and his wife were actively involved in personal work. And both of them are now deceased. But the last time that I saw him, maybe 6-7 years ago, he came up to me and he said, "Brother Tom, I reached a milestone today, this week." And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "I baptized my 500th person." Who'd have ever guessed it out of him? He was not attention-getting, but he was actively involved in the Lord's work. So there's some things that we have to guard against. Caution has to be exercised. Second of all, truth has to be applied. Look at chapter 5, verse 17. "Wherefore be ye not foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Understand what the will of the Lord is. Study is written all over that. It's all over it. So think about this. James chapter 3, Colossians 4, Colossians 1, verse 9. All of these emphasize not just knowing something, but doing that thing as well. And of course, James 2 could be added to that. If you're not working, your faith is not of any value if it's not a working faith. So truth has to be applied. Learn the truth and then apply it. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do. Great advice, is it not? Then look at this. Time has to be utilized. Look at chapter 5, verse 19. "Speaking one to another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs." No, it's not 19. "Redeeming the time." I'm looking at verse 16. Time, that should be verse 16. "Redeeming the time because the days are evil." I read somewhere that Maximilian Robespierre, when he went to the guillotine, handed a watch to somebody as he began to ascend the stairs, and he said, "This is yours. Where I'm going, it'll be of no value to me." Each one of us is given a certain time span from the time we're born into this world to the time we leave. What are you doing with that? Utilize your time. And I pulled the plug on television 40 years ago, 35, 40 years ago. I just got sick of what I was seeing. It's a whole lot worse now. We waste more time on television, movies. I'm not saying those things are inherently wrong, But I think we need to be careful as to how we use our time. I'm asked, and I'm not, I say this with a sense of humility and appreciation that God's given me the opportunities that I have. But look, people ask me, how do you write so much? How do you get so much written? I just try not to waste my time. I try to take advantage of every little opportunity. I carry books with me when I'm sitting in the doctor's office or on the plane. I'm just constantly trying to read. And we need to use our time wisely. I want you to think about this passage in Psalm 90, verses 9 and 10. This was written by Moses after the wilderness wandering, and Moses basically was talking about using what God had given to us. And he focuses on the fact that our days are swifter than a shuttle. They're just gone. 70 years, and if by reason 80, your life is still, it ends up toil and trouble and difficulty. And Moses certainly could have understood that. Here are some things that could be considered a wise use of time. Study, doing good to others, making a living. I wish I had time to just deal with some more of these, but I just don't. Here are some things that are unwise, of course. Excessive amusements. Notice I said excessive. Everybody's got to have some time to engage in recreation. But we have to be careful that it doesn't dominate our lives. Television, luxurious, indulgent, lazy, idle, chatter, procrastination, and you could add to that list. So caution exercised, truth applied, time utilized. Understanding individualized. This has to do with study. And a number of times in Ephesians, the focus on study. Ephesians 1:18 and 19, Paul prayed that their eyes might be enlightened. But enlightenment is not going to come without study. The Holy Spirit's not going to zap you and give you all the knowledge you need. You've got to spend time and study. Ephesians 3:3-4, how that by revelation was made known to me the mystery, as I wrote, Paul says, whereby when you do what? When you read, you can perceive my understanding of the mystery of Christ. Hosea 4:6, people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. 2 Timothy 2:15, I have to be involved in study. So understanding has to be individualized. Then abstinence has to be exercised. Look at verse 18. And be not drunken with wine, wherein is right, but be filled with the Spirit. That's not just moderation. I'm talking about abstinence. And one of those is alcoholic beverage. Medicinal purposes, yes. Paul told Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. I wish I could spend a whole lesson on this, but let's move on. And this one right here, I'll take a few minutes as we close out, because seeing that we are men leading, I want you to look at some of the relationships that have to be harmonized. Go to Ephesians 5. Let's start with verse 21, all right? Subjecting yourselves one to another in the fear of Christ. Wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, and Christ also, as Christ is the head of the church, being self the Savior of the body. This is not what Paul is dealing with here. He's not dealing with a headship that is tyrannical, overbearing. He's dealing with a headship that involves love. And so what does he say in the very next verse? Husbands, verse 25, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church. Agape love. Love your wives. Don't talk about them out in public. Don't discuss their faults. You're to protect that woman and to treat her as a precious jewel to you. I beg of you, love your wives like you should. So your relationship, there has to be harmony in the home. And then move down a little bit further to chapter 6. There has to be harmonization between the parents and the children. That harmonization is brought about by children respecting their parents and parents raising their children properly. I've always noticed, I don't think this is by accident. If a husband loves his wife like he should, the wife will have no problem submitting to her husband like she should. All things else being equal. The parents who raise their children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, as they're supposed to, will have no problem with their children submitting to them. Now, those are general rules. Sometimes there are always exceptions to the rule. But we're looking at what God recommends, what God commands, and the great wisdom that's there. And so that's the walk in light and the wisdom. And tomorrow I'm going to deal specifically with the Christian and his battles. We're talking about the armor as well. I'll give you 2 minutes back, Rick. 3 minutes. I'll give you 3 minutes back.
I am tempted to say that if I was Jason, I would take those 3 minutes, but I'm going to exercise a little self-control. Well, okay, maybe not, but I'm going to give you that 3 minutes, so we'll be dismissed until the next hour.